Chapter 011. Limiters. Why is your test longer than mine? Benasek whispered to him hurriedly. Did I lose a page or something? You didn't, Zorian whispered back. Nora is just testing me because, well, it doesn't matter. I'll tell you later. Zorian sighed and continued pondering the advanced spell formula questions in front of him. As if the original 60-question test hadn't been enough. Worse, Nora took a page out of Ilsa's book and decided to test him on knowledge that he technically shouldn't even have, because the additional questions had nothing to do with second-year curriculum. Thankfully, he had actually read all 12 of her recommended books over the course of several previous restarts, so he wasn't completely stumped while looking at the piece of paper in front of him. Still, the additional questions were encouraging, since they suggested Nora was taking him a lot more seriously than she usually did when he asked for some advanced instructions out of her. In the handful of restarts he had tried, the results were underwhelming. While enthusiastic about her subject, Nora Bull never seemed to believe he was as advanced as he claimed. All of his teachers were like that, as far as he could tell from his initial attempts, with Karen being the biggest exception. Though now that he thought about it, that probably had more to do with the ease with which his proficiency with the magic missile spell could be demonstrated, rather than Karen's inclination to believe his claims. In any case, the sheer speed with which things were happening gave him hope. It was only yesterday that he and Ilsa had talked in her office, and already Nora was testing him. That was absurdly fast, since teachers like to take their time about things like this. Zorian had expected the entire process to take a week, at least. Apparently he had left an even bigger impression on Ilsa than he thought he had. Good. It was nice to have a confirmation that he was actually going somewhere, rather than just wasting his time. A few minutes later his peace was once again broken by Benasek. He gritted his teeth as the boy started to pester him for answers. Zorian had always found Benasek to be somewhat annoying, despite him being Zorian's best friend, or at least the closest thing to it, but Zorian found himself steadily losing his patience with the boy as restart after restart went by. It wasn't really fair to Benasek. The chubby boy was behaving no worse than his usual fare, but the time loop made Benasek's antics annoyingly repetitive. He quickly scribbled answers to a handful of questions on a piece of paper and thrust it at Benasek. Benasek looked like he would say something to him in his not whisper. Benasek whispered far too loudly for it to be called a real whisper, but Zorian silenced him with a quick glare. As annoying as Benasek might be, Zorian wasn't ready to give up on him just yet. Whether that resolve would hold throughout the entire time loop remained to be seen, however. All right, time's up. Pencils down, everyone, Nora said, earning her a wave of protests from the student body. Except for Mr. Kaczynski, that is. He can keep working on that special second test I gave him. Zorian cursed internally as all eyes momentarily shifted towards him. She just had to tell that in front of the whole class, didn't she? He made a note to himself to watch what he said in front of Nora, since discretion obviously wasn't her strong suit. Akoja hurriedly collected all the tests, lingering slightly longer near his desk so she could see what his special test was all about. After that, the class continued as normal. It was the exact same thing he had already listened to countless times before in the previous restarts, so he did his best to block it out and continue solving the test. Even with his massively unfair advantage, the test was rather hard. Spell formula in general involved a lot of mathematics and geometry, as the very name of the discipline hinted at, and that automatically made it hard for a lot of people, him included. Eventually the class came to an end, and Nora asked him to stay behind while everyone else filed out of the classroom. She immediately started to look over his tests when the last of his classmates left, and Zorian watched her intently for a reaction. Unlike Svim, or even Ilsa, Nora Bull was a very expressive woman. By the time she had reached the end of the first test, he could see she was pleasantly surprised. She damn well should be, considering it was 100% correct. When she started inspecting the second test, though, her face quickly morphed first into shock, and then barely restrained glee. Evidently she liked what she saw. Finally, she set the test aside and met his eyes, giving him a penetrating gaze that actually caused Zorian to flinch a little. She reminded him of Zack and Kira Thieschli, because she seemed to radiate a similar sort of vibrancy, for the lack of a better word. It was always a bit uncomfortable being around people like that, especially when they were focused solely on him like Nora currently was. Well, she began. I didn't expect that. Do you know why I gave you the second test? No, said Zorian. To scare me off? Exactly. Nora exclaimed. Exactly. Zorian blinked, unable to believe she actually admitted that to his face. Spell formulas require bravery. They require passion, continued Nora animatedly. Funny. Everyone else said they required patience and meticulousness. They require determination. Anyone who is scared off by this little thing here, she waved the second test in front of his face, will surely give up when we delve into the truly difficult parts of the discipline. I had to make sure you wouldn't bail out on me somewhere along the line. Zorian was starting to feel a little unnerved by Nora's outburst. Was he signing up for spell formula tutoring or cult membership? Of course, I didn't actually expect you to solve any of the questions correctly, Nora said. I just wanted to see if you'd leave it completely blank. Not that I'm complaining, far from it. Let's see. She went back to her desk and pulled out a stack of papers out of a drawer. She frowned as she leafed through them, apparently unhappy about their contents, before finally setting them aside with a sigh. After an entire minute of silence, she glanced towards him and shook her head, as if suddenly remembering he was still there. Tell me, what are spell formulas? She asked him. And I don't want to hear a textbook definition. I want to hear it in your words. Zorian opened his mouth for a moment and then quickly snapped it shut as he considered what to say. Come on, Nora encouraged. Bravery, remember? Besides, I just want to know your opinion. There is no right answer.
Ha!
There might be no right answer, but Zorian knew from experience that there was always a wrong answer. Always. But he supposed that, in this particular instance, silence was the wrongest answer of them all. It's the practice of using geometric shapes and various sigils to modify spells, usually in order to strengthen wards or amplify spell casting, said Zorian. Really? How do they do that? Asked Nora in mock curiosity. They limit mana flow along predetermined pathways, tried Zorian. Yes, agreed Nora. They limit, that's exactly what they do. I can't tell you how many mages think there's some kind of inherent amplifier or something. Drives me crazy, I tell you. Of course, most modern crafters use special materials that are inherent amplifiers, but that's something else entirely. Anyway, you know the point behind structured spell casting, right? The narrower the effect of the spell is, the more mana efficient it becomes. Structured magic creates a spell boundary to forcibly narrow down effect space into something manageable for a human spellcaster. And spell formulas are the exact same thing, only with more pronounced benefits and drawbacks, said Nora. Since mages can take their time when crafting the spell formula, they limit the mana flow much more tightly than your typical invocation. This means bigger potential benefits, but also makes the spell even more inflexible. And, of course, the tighter spell boundary means there is less margin for errors, so designing a working spell formula is a lot harder than designing a working invocation. Zorian waited patiently until she was finished, not really sure why she was telling him these things. This was all basic theory that he had heard and read 1,000 times, but unwilling to interrupt. Unfortunately, it appeared he would have to wait to hear what the point of her little questioning was, because Nora suddenly looked at the clock hanging by the door and blanched when she realized how much time had passed. "Sorry, Mr. Kaczynski, I guess I got carried away." "You better go to the next class before I get you in trouble," Nora said apologetically. Zorian shrugged. He had intended to skip the next class one way or another, but it probably wouldn't impress her much if he told her that. "I'll need a few days to set up a schedule, so I'll tell you the details via Ilsa. We'll have a blast working together, I can already tell." He was just about to leave when she suddenly started talking again. "Oh, I almost forgot. Go see Ilsa sometime today, she has something she wants to talk to you about. Something about you returning a favor you owe her for setting this up." Now why did that sound kind of ominous? Break. Sayoria's main train station was always busy. There was a sort of hurried feeling suffusing the entire area that Zorian found either annoying or invigorating, depending on his current mood. When he was disembarking from the train, it served as a metaphorical bucket of cold water to wake him up from a long sleepy journey, and he welcomed it. When he was simply standing on platform number 6, waiting for the train to arrive, it was oppressive and unwelcome, and he desperately wished he knew how to suppress it. Especially since the damned train was 2 hours late. In order to amuse himself and pass the time, he had taken to harassing the numerous pigeons and sparrows milling around the place. Not physically, of course, that would be not only childish, but would also cause people to stare at him. He was instead pushing his mana at them, trying to control them mentally. Of course, simply pushing mana at something and wishing for it to happen wasn't enough to do real magic, but it did seem to agitate them a lot. Typically, whatever bird he was concentrating on became increasingly erratic as seconds went by before fleeing away from the area after a minute or so. Finally, the shrill whistle of the incoming train broke him out of his concentration, and the local wildlife was spared further indignation. Zorian scanned the crowd of people disembarking from the train, searching for his target. He was technically supposed to hold a sign and wait, but he was confident he could spot the guy without problem. It's not like there'd be many white-haired teenagers on the train platform, after all. It actually wasn't as bad as he'd thought it would be, this favor Ilsa had asked of him. Admittedly, helping a transfer student carry his luggage and showing him around the city would waste an entire day, but on the bright side, he was excused from attending today's classes. Besides, it would give him a legitimate excuse to approach Kale, the transfer student in question. The Morlock boy was a bit unapproachable even at the best of days, and Zorian had been thinking of trying to befriend him. He really ought to find some friends beside Benasek, and Kale seemed like someone he could get along well with. If he turned out to be wrong, well, it's not like the Morlock would remember any awkwardness between them once the time loop reset itself again, would he? Finally, he spotted Kale disembarking and moved towards him to help him with his luggage. It wasn't just an empty gesture of goodwill on Zorian's part, either. Kale was clearly having problems with his burden, probably because he could only use one arm to manipulate the heavy bags. The other hand was currently supporting a little girl that clung to Kale's side like a barnacle, observing everything around her with childlike intensity. Kale was momentarily surprised when Zorian wordlessly started helping him, but quickly went along with it. The little girl clutching his side was now staring at Zorian with undisguised curiosity, and Zorian wondered who she was. Was this his little sister? Her vivid blue eyes certainly reminded him of Kale, since the Morlock had eyes of the exact same shade, but her hair was jet black, and she didn't look very much like a Morlock to Zorian. And in any case, surely the boy wouldn't bring a child this young with him? Zorian kept expecting her mother to step out of the train and take the little girl out of Kale's hands, but somehow that never happened. Finally, the last of the bags was standing on the floor and Kale finally turned towards him. "Thank you," the boy said politely. For all his aloofness, Kale was never actually rude. "I'm Kale Tveranov. I'm not normally this inept, but it's hard to handle the luggage with one hand. Kana has been rather clingy today, and I didn't have the heart to pry her off." The move was too stressful for her, I'm afraid. It's no problem, Zorian said. I'm here to help, after all, that's what Ilsa sent me here for. I'm Zorian Kaczynski, one of your classmates. Ilsa's lady sent me here to help you with your luggage and show you around the city. Kale gave him a startled look, clutching the little girl attached to his hip like Zorian was about to snatch her away. What? Zorian asked, surprised at the alarm in the boy's posture. Was it something I said? I didn't mean to offend. Kale gave him a long, suspicious look, before finally reaching a decision of some sort. You didn't do anything, Mr. Kaczynski, and it is I who should apologize, Kale said finally. Allow me to introduce myself again, I am Kale Tveranov, and this is my daughter, Kana. Zorian stared at the Morlock for a moment, before glancing at his daughter. Kana gave him a shy wave, but otherwise remained silent. She was very young, probably around 3 years of age, but Kale wasn't much older than Zorian. That would mean Kale was 13 or so at the time she was born. Huh. Talk about being a young parent. I see, he said finally. And he really did, too. Kale probably got enough grief from people around him over being a Morlock without adding this sort of fuel to the fire. If Zorian was in his place, he would have done everything he could to keep this sort of thing from his classmates as well. If you're afraid I'll go around telling all our classmates about you having a daughter, you don't have to worry, I understand the need for discretion in matters like this. Kale breathed a sigh of relief. Thank you. Don't mention it, Zorian said, waving him off. Considering the child's mother wasn't here with them, there was probably a very stressful story in there somewhere. He would have to be a total jackass to set the academy rumor mill on the poor guy by telling them about this. He was a little curious as to how the boy intended to watch over his daughter while attending the academy, but supposed he had already arranged for a nanny of some sort for the child. I'll just cast a quick spell to carry your luggage and then we'll be off. Zorian quickly cast the floating disc spell, and a ghostly horizontal circle flickered into existence in front of them. It was a very useful spell that they were supposed to learn in Ilsa's class somewhere in the middle of the 3rd year, but Zorian had been proactive enough to track it down in one of the restarts. It was similar to the shield spell in mechanics, but this particular force construct was mobile and optimized for supporting weight as opposed to absorbing blows. It dutifully floated after them as they started walking out of the train station. Interesting, Kale said. I must admit that, when Ilsa told me my education is severely lacking in many areas, I thought she was exaggerating. Is this what an average 3rd-year student is like? Well, no, said Zorian. I'm actually way beyond what a 3rd-year student should be. Though I'm hardly unique in my skill. Kale hummed thoughtfully. Why would your education be lacking, anyway? Asked Zorian. Kale remained silent for a few seconds, and Zorian was just about to conclude the Morlock wasn't interested in talking when the boy finally decided to answer. My education was unconventional, said Kale. I was a sort of unofficial apprentice to a village mage. One that wasn't a member of the guild. Her skills were somewhat specialized, so much of my proficiency with magic is a product of my own personal efforts. In other words, I'm largely self-taught. Zorian's respect for the other boy rose a few notches after hearing this. Magic was hard enough to learn with proper instruction. For a young boy to go at it all by himself and get far enough to join a 3rd-year class, though if he's such a genius. I hope I'm not being too nosy, but dash. But why am I going into Cyoria, now? Guessed Kale. I got a pretty good offer from the academy, and it wasn't like I had anyone stopping me from leaving. My parents died when I was young, and my teacher, she got sick during the weeping. As did my wife. Kana is the only family I have left. Zorian flinched. Oh gods, I didn't mean dash. Kale shook his head. Don't worry about it, Mr. Kaczynski. If I was to fall apart every time someone broached that topic, I would have to become a hermit and avoid people completely. It is natural to be curious about these things. Zorian still felt pretty terrible. He had pretty much assumed Kale had gotten some girl pregnant and later had to take responsibility for the child. But no, the guy had been married and everything. A bit shocking to marry and have children so young in this day and age, but hardly unheard of. He studied Kale out of the corner of his eyes in the resulting silence. The boy looked very delicate, with pale, willowy physique and gentle facial lines. Coupled with his shoulder-length white hair, it gave him a rather feminine appearance. Nonetheless, the boy clearly had no shortage of inner strength if he could move on after losing so many people to the horrible sickness. Back in Siren, there was a woman who had lost a husband and both sons to the bloody tears fever, and never managed to move past that. She had actually blamed the entire Kaczynski family for her tragedy, claiming they had used their magic powers to curse her loved ones because of some petty disagreement. Zorian would be the first person to admit he and his family were no angels, but that was just absurd. And kind of sad. "There is no need to pity me, Mr. Kaczynski," said Kale, breaking him out of his thoughts. "Oh, I don't pity you," Zorian said. "I think you're very inspiring, actually. You're a single parent who somehow managed to find the time to teach himself magic to such a degree that a world-renowned institution like the Academy in Syoria acknowledged your potential. They gave you a scholarship, didn't they?" Kale nodded. "I wouldn't be able to attend otherwise. They rarely give out scholarships, you know?" Zorian said. "About 5 to 6 of them each year. You must be pretty amazing to have caught their attention like that." "It's mostly my medical expertise," Kale sighed. "I made a vow to myself after, well, you know. I swore to myself I would become the best healer of the age and make sure a tragedy such as the weeping can never happen again." Wow. Zorian didn't know what to say to something like that. "I made quite a lot of progress on that front, if you permit me to be a little immodest here," Kale said. "But, well, it's complicated. We can talk later, if you're still interested. Me and Kana are rather tired from the journey and I'd like to retire for the day." Kana especially. Zorian suddenly noticed Kana was starting to doze off on Kale's shoulder. She had been so quiet throughout his entire interaction with Kale that he had almost forgotten she's there. If only Kiriel could be that docile. "Yes, sorry about that," Zorian apologized. "I got carried away, I guess. I'll have to give you a tour of the city some other time, then." They spent the rest of the walk in comfortable silence. Break. "You were absent yesterday." Zorian gave Akoja an annoyed look. She wasn't going to give him grief over that, was she? "I was excused," he noted. "I know," Akoja said. "I was just wondering where you were." Zorian was about to tell her it wasn't her damn business where he went in his free time, but then he reconsidered. He was getting strange vibes off Akoja, almost as if she was concerned about him. Very strange. Normally he would write it off as just another weird thing Akoja did from time to time. The girl seemed to have logic all of her own sometimes, one that not even her obsession with rules could explain, but his recent conversation with Kale stopped him. Was he too dismissive of other people? Up until yesterday, Kale was simply that Morlock transfer student to Zorian. It brought back memories of his conversations with Zack, and the other boys' remarks about Zorian's behavior in previous restarts, before he became aware of the time loop. "I was doing a favor for Ilsa," Zorian said. "Showing our newest transfer student around the city and such." "Oh," Akoja said, glancing at Kale for a moment. The white-haired boy was sitting several rows behind Zorian, silent and aloof as always. He gave virtually no indication that he knew Zorian was in the classroom, but Zorian could feel the Morlock's eyes on him from time to time. Who is he anyway? Kale Tveranov, Zorian answered. I didn't mean his name, Akoja huffed, realizing, after a few seconds of silence, that he wasn't going to say anything else. Not sure what else to tell you, Zorian shrugged. He sounded like a good person to me. He looks kind of arrogant, Akoja remarked. And girly. Well, how judgmental of you, Zorian remarked with a frown. You come off as a bit arrogant yourself, you know? Well, so much for being nice to Akoja. She stomped off soon after that, shooting him a nasty glare. Resolving to be more understanding towards people was hard. Break. It took Nora Bull only 2 days to organize their first lesson, and the moment Zorian stepped into the classroom Nora had reserved for them, he realized Nora was taking this very seriously. It was a professional-looking workshop, the sort that students normally couldn't access without special permission from the teachers. Nora beckoned him forward, positively radiating excitement and enthusiasm. Suddenly he remembered why he had been pensive about getting instruction from her. Considering the amount of homework and additional reading Nora assigned as a matter of course during her classes, Zorian dreaded finding out what she considered an appropriate workload for an actually talented student. You're too quiet, she complained. Courage, Zorian, courage. Right, agreed Zorian half-heartedly. We'll make a proper crafter out of you yet, just you see, huffed Nora. But first, let me just wrap up our discussion from last time. I was a little long-winded, but what I had been trying to build up to was that spell formula R, support magic. Magic affecting other magic. By itself, even the most elegant spell formula is merely a theoretical exercise. You need to actually cast the spells and anchor them to the spell formula before it's of any use. I note this because Ilsa seemed to think your skill in invocations would do you no good in my subject, which annoyed me because it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the discipline. Which is very disappointing, coming from her, since she is, well, you know. A teacher, finished Zorian.
Yeah,
Nora agreed, a little awkwardly. Teachers rarely spoke ill of one another, in Zorian's experience, so it was no wonder why she was uncomfortable criticizing Ilsa in front of a student. They did have to work with one another on a regular basis, after all, and undermining other teachers' authority like that could get ugly very quickly. Fortunately, only Zorian was present in this case, and he didn't intend to make trouble for her. She seemed to realize it too, after a moment, because she smiled and continued as if nothing had happened. Anyway, I guess we should get you started on the beginner's cube. As it turned out, the beginner's cube was a perfectly cubical block of gray stone, each side roughly 10 centimeters long. The one Zorian was given was completely blank and smooth, but Nora showed him a couple of finished ones as a demonstration. They did things like heat up, shed light, or float in the air when activated, or when certain conditions were met. Basically, each finished cube was a crude magic item that used a couple of simple spells and a whole lot of spell formula to produce a neat little toy. They were a standard training tool, according to Nora. Zorian wanted one the moment he had laid his eyes on them. Giving such a blatantly magical toy to Kiriel would probably keep her out of his hair for hours. It would be his secret weapon against her. Besides, a small floating cube would make a much more challenging target for his magic missile practice than the boulders and tree trunks he usually practiced on. Especially if he could somehow get it to dodge. He wouldn't have to wait long to acquire one. As it turned out, crafting one was the idea behind today's lesson. And not just any beginner's cube, either. Zorian had expected Nora to give him something easy for a start, but apparently she had something a little more ambitious in mind. But those ones are too easy for you, Nora concluded. No, I have something much more fun for you to work on. Here. She handed him another cube, though this one was positively covered with spell formula. Zorian noted with rising dread that he couldn't make heads or tails of it. Hell, many of the sections looked like mere placeholders instead of working spell formula, being little more than stylized pictograms. Wait. As you may have noticed, I compressed the spell formula somewhat, Nora said. Partially it's because there wasn't enough space on the cube to represent it fully in its raw form, and partially to stop you from simply copying the entire thing line by line on the blank one I gave you earlier. Isn't that the whole point? Zorian asked. For me to study a working example to see how it's done, that is? Absolutely. But I'm afraid blindly copying the spell formula from one cube to another won't teach you what I want you to learn. If I thought you needed to practice memorization and precision, I'd have you copy a dozen or so easy ones to start with, but I'm sure you're already beyond that. No one spends as much time on spell formula theory as you have without trying out some practical examples. I never encountered anything like those cubes in the texts I read, said Zorian. But yes, I have been using spell formulas from time to time. Mostly to establish an alarm perimeter around my bed during my second year. I had a really nosy roommate, and also to make some free lamps and heating plates. Invocations didn't last long. Even if a mage poured more mana into them than absolutely necessary, and there was only so much you could overpower a spell before it shattered from the strain, they inevitably degraded after a couple of hours at most. The spell boundary degraded with time and eventually fell apart, regardless of whether the spell had enough mana left or not. As a consequence, if Zorian wanted his alarm spell to last throughout the entire night, or his makeshift lamp not to wink out every hour or so, he had to stabilize the spell boundary somehow. Spell formulas were the easiest and most reliable way to do that, so long as someone already crafted a stabilization formula for that particular spell and made it available to the public. It's not very surprising you never encountered beginner's cubes in your reading, Nora said. They're mostly used for theoretical exercises. Not very useful. Most mages don't really care how spell formulas work, only that they do. They memorize the well-documented formulas and some quick and dirty methods of modifying existing ones, and then they only have to know when to apply which one. Then they say spell formulas are dry and boring.
Ha!
If only they knew the true mysteries of the art, the hidden beauty of numbers and geometry. Zorian listened stoically as Nora mumbled to herself about unimaginative rabble and sleeping in the bed they made for themselves for a while. After a while she took a deep breath and plastered a pleasant smile on her face before turning her attention to him again. There was no sane teacher in this school, it seemed. Zorian wondered whether it was the stress of teaching itself that was producing these kind of effects, or if you simply had to be crazy to accept a teaching position here. But I digress, Nora said cheerfully. I guess I should stop wasting our time and tell you what I want you to do. Here, let me demonstrate. Break. The cube Nora wanted Zorian to recreate was quite complicated. At its core, it was a glorified lamp using a simple torch spell as its base. It could be activated and deactivated verbally, by saying one of the several command words, and it had to be able to tell when someone was referring to it specifically, as opposed to using the command word in some other context. It had 3 different brightness settings. It conserved mana by not shedding light from any side that was covered by something. The side resting on the floor didn't shine, for example, and wrapping it in a blanket would cause it to turn itself off. Each individual side could be turned on and off by tapping on it twice in quick succession. It could be keyed in to a specific person, taking orders from him or her alone. Nora had told him not to worry if he couldn't duplicate it exactly. She only wanted to see how far he'd get on his own by the next time they met. That was good, because this assignment was far more complex than anything spell formula related he had done up until now. Their next session was on Monday, so he had an entire weekend to work with, but he doubted he could fully rise to the challenge. He had mixed feelings about Nora's teaching methods. On one hand, she was taking him seriously, and that was good. On the other hand, she seemed to think that throwing a person overboard was a perfectly valid way of teaching people how to swim, metaphorically speaking. "Come in." Zorian sighed before stepping into Svim's office. What a wonderful way to end a week. For all her faults, he infinitely preferred Nora's way of teaching compared to that of Svim. "Zorian Kaczynski?" "Sit down, please," Svim ordered, not even bothering to wait for an answer. Zorian caught the pen the man had thrown at him with practiced ease, and then promptly caused it to float off the palm of his hand, gently spinning in the air. Whoops. He hadn't meant to do that. Oh well, let's see what the man will say about that. "Make it glow," Svim barked out without skipping a beat, completely unfazed by Zorian's skill. Zorian wasn't even surprised anymore. The pen promptly snapped back to his hand and erupted in soft ghostly glow. He cycled through various colors without prompting from Svim, occasionally changing the intensity of the light just to prove he could. Svim arched his eyebrow at him. "I didn't say you could stop levitating the pen." Zorian's lips twitched in an aborted smile. If Svim thought he would stump him with that, he was very much mistaken. Combining two different shaping exercises was an obvious thing to do, and Zorian had already tried it. Moments later, the pen was spinning in the air in front of him, glowing. Svim tapped his finger on the desk thoughtfully. Was it possible? Had he really managed to give the man pause? The world was coming to an end. Zorian watched in anticipation, wondering what the crazy man would think up next. "I suppose there is no point in testing your ability to burn things." That was always the easiest exercise of the three, Svim mused. As a point of fact, Zorian was a bit deficient in the burning exercise, at least compared to the other two. Not that he was going to tell that to Svim, of course. "Your essentials are adequate. Almost decent, though not quite. Your attitude could use some work, but I suppose you at least have more tact than most of the unfortunates that haunt these halls. Plus, Miss Salady has appealed to me on your behalf, asking me to be not such a hardest towards you. As such, as much as I'd like to shake up your woefully shaky foundations, I'm going to reluctantly move on to something slightly more advanced." To Zorian's great confusion, Svim handed him a strip of cloth. What was he supposed to do with that? It's a blindfold, Svim explained. You put it over your eyes so you can't see. And why do I need a blindfold again? Zorian asked. We're going to train your ability to sense mana, said Svim. You're going to put the blindfold on, and then I'm going to throw these mana-charged marbles at you. Zorian stared at the man incredulously. Had he really heard him right? I'm either going to throw them over your left shoulder, over your right shoulder, or straight at your head. If you get hit by a marble, you lose a point. If you move when you don't have to, you lose a point. Otherwise you receive a point. We'll stop when you accrue 10 points or our time runs out. Yes, he really had heard him right. Thank you so much for your help, Ilsa. Thank you so much. Break. The next 2 weeks were busy, but routine. He directed most of his efforts towards mastering spell formulas, largely because Nora was very willing to indulge him. The harder he tried in their lessons, the more enthusiastic she became about teaching him. She even suggested they meet on Sundays for additional instruction, apparently not having any private obligations to distract her. He had learned much, but Nora set a grueling pace, and he was glad the restart was fast approaching. He doubted he could last much more than a month of Nora's teaching. Interestingly, he seemed to be attracting attention from the teachers and students alike in this particular restart. Maybe it was him impressing Ilsa as much as he did, maybe it was the way he quietly went with the insane workload Nora gave him, or maybe Svim said something nice about him to the other teachers. Well, probably not that last part, since he had made little progress in mastering Svim's current exercise. In any case, he was getting a lot of attention for his efforts, which was rather curious. Most of the time, no matter how hard he tried in class, everyone was pretty flat about it. He thought about trying to leverage all that attention into something useful, but he was too exhausted by his studies to plot properly. Some other restart perhaps. The attention had the unfortunate side effect of wrecking any chance he had of befriending Kale. Associating with Zorian would surely bring great scrutiny on the Morlock, something the boy was understandably concerned about, so Zorian wasn't surprised the other boy never sought him out. Frankly, he wasn't sure he could befriend the boy even in normal circumstances. The Morlock had a daughter waiting for him at home, and thus probably wouldn't want to spend his time after class socializing with friends. Akoja was extremely pleased with him, though. Zorian couldn't really understand why, but she was. And then it happened. Suddenly, without any warning, there was a wrenching sensation and everything went black. He woke up, as usual, with Kiriel lying on top of him, looking smug. There were two possibilities that Zorian could think of to explain this occurrence. The first one was that something or someone had killed him so fast he was dead before he realized it. He was skeptical of this, as he had done nothing to warrant an assassination, and he couldn't think of any natural force that could kill so suddenly and thoroughly. He hadn't even felt any pain before he died. The second possibility was much more likely, and also much more worrying. While he was minding his business, learning spell formulas in Cyoria, Zack was off somewhere in the world, doing insanely dangerous things. Zack died. When he did, his soul was dragged into the past to start over, and it dragged Zorian's soul back with it. Which would make Zorian's soul bonded to Zack. Damn it. Chapter 012. Soul Web. Zorian stomped into his room, closing the door behind him with way more force than necessary. He should have known he wouldn't find out anything about soul bonds that he hadn't already known, but it was still annoying to come back empty-handed after spending an entire day in the library. The books all repeated the same warnings he received back in his first year. Soul bonds were a dangerous and poorly understood branch of magic, capable of causing some pretty horrifying side effects if used recklessly. Every once in a while, some ill-informed couple decide that soul bonding themselves together would be the most romantic thing ever, only for everything to end up in tears and lawsuits a few months later when complications surface. The main issue was that one of the participants usually started to mentally and spiritually dominate the other, making them more like themselves in mind and soul, not to mention disturbingly obedient and deferential. This was a good thing when binding animals as familiars, since it was almost always the animal that got dominated by the human, and animals actually tended to benefit from such domination by developing higher intelligence and better control over their magical abilities, if they had any. Sentient beings usually had issues with someone magically subverting their entire personality and worldview, however. At least until the soul bond finished, turning them into a serval clone, that is. Zorian ran a trembling hand through his hair and started to clean his glasses with the hem of his shirt to calm himself down. He really hoped he was wrong and that there was no soul bond between him and Zack. Zack had 6 times larger mana reserves than Zorian's theoretical maximum, was naturally more outgoing and confident, and, thanks to being in the time loop far longer than Zorian, was probably decades older than him too. No points for guessing who'd be the dominant one between the two of them. The worst thing about it was that he couldn't even go to someone for help. He was pretty sure the soul bond, or whatever it was responsible for him looping around along with Zack. If he asked someone for help, they'd insist on severing the bond, an understandable sentiment and something he'd eagerly agree to in normal circumstances, which would cause him to lose everything he had gained inside the time loop, memories included, once Zack started over at the end of the month.
Yeah.
He was totally screwed. He took a couple of deep breaths and put his glasses back on. Maybe he was looking at things too fatalistically. Considering the sheer size of disparity between him and Zack, he should have experienced some pretty massive personality shifts by now, and he didn't notice anything of the sort. He certainly wasn't feeling submissive towards anyone, least of all Zach. Obviously things weren't as bad as they seemed. He could very well be overreacting and overlooking some other, perfectly reasonable explanation for the unscheduled restart. Someone was knocking. Who could possibly? Oh. Right. Taven. He sighed heavily. Just what he needed right now. The knocking turned into banging, prompting him to finally open the door. Hi, Roach. Hi, Taven, Zorian said in a slightly suffering tone. How nice of you to visit me. Do you want to come in? Taven promptly did what she always did once he let her inside. She jumped on his bed and made herself comfortable. Zorian shrugged and went after her. Best to get it over with quickly. Didn't you graduate? He asked. You said you were going to go into exploration after you graduate. What happened to that? She gave him a sour look. It's not that simple. No expedition is going to take a complete beginner like me with them. I need an established explorer to take me as an apprentice. I'm working on it. Funny, I heard you're working as a class assistant to Nurthak, Zorian remarked. Isn't that going to interfere with searching for another master? Well, sort of, she admitted. But I'm not literally searching for another job at this point. I'm actually trying to build up my reputation and get people to notice me by doing missions and such. In fact, that's what I came to talk to you about. I'd like you to join me and a couple of others on a job tomorrow. Sounds suspicious, Zorian said. What could a measly third year help you with? Fill out our numbers? Taven answered. We can't take the job until there are 4 or more of us, and we're 1 short of that. Well, why does the job require 4 people? Asked Zorian, knowing from previous restarts that this was the fastest avenue to shut down Taven's excuses. Surely the employer didn't put that there just to be mean to groups like yours. It's supposedly dangerous, Taven huffed, folding her arms across her chest. The old man is overreacting. The spiders aren't even that big from what he told us. Spiders, prodded Zorian.
Yeah,
Taven said hesitantly, apparently realizing she probably shouldn't have mentioned that. Spiders. You know, hairy 8-legged dash. Taven, Zorian warned. Oh come on, Roach, I'm begging you. Taven whined. I swear it's not as dangerous as it sounds. We've been in the tunnels hundreds of times and it wasn't that dangerous at all. We can protect you easily. Hundreds of times? Asked Zorian dubiously. Well, a dozen times at least, she relented. Zorian was just about to tell her no, like he usually did at this point, but then he stopped himself. He probably wouldn't be able to do anything remotely productive for at least a week, what with the possibility of a soul bond between him and Zach weighing heavily on his mind and all. A nice distracting stroll through the sewers might be just what the doctor ordered, so to speak. Sure, he said. Really? She squealed. Yes, really, confirmed Zorian. Just tell me where to meet you tomorrow before I change my mind. A few minutes later Taven left, thanking him profusely and kissing him on the cheek for being a friend before running off to wherever she had been going, he supposed. He didn't ask, being too shocked by her kiss, innocuous as it may have been. He was a bit angry at himself for being so affected by a silly kiss on the cheek, but he supposed he shouldn't be too hard on his subconscious. She was his former crush, after all. He decided he had had enough of everything for the day and drank one of the sleeping potions he kept in his stash. Hopefully things would seem clearer after a good night's rest. Break. The next morning he woke up a bit more level-headed than he had been after his visit to the library, and things didn't seem as hopeless as they had the day before. He had been jumping to conclusions, and needed more information. he was tempted to skip classes for the day to have another go at the library, but he suspected that he lacked both the research skills and the access level to properly tackle a restricted topic like soul bonds. And besides, there was someone in his class he absolutely had to talk to, Briam, the guy with a fire drake familiar. Surely someone who was already soul bonded to another, even if it was to a magical animal instead of another human, could tell him more about those blasted things. I see your family has given you a fire drake of your own, he said conversationally, sitting down beside Briam and ignoring the threatening hissing of the fire drake. For some reason, the ill-tempered beast never saw fit to attack him in previous restarts, so he didn't think it would start now. Is he your familiar already? Yes, Briam confirmed, clearly pleased with that. I bonded with him just this summer actually. A bit strange, at first, but I think I'm getting the hang of it. Strange? Asked Zorian. How so? Well, it's mostly the bond being there, you know? Briam said. So the bond can be felt? Zorian said speculatively, trying not to let his excitement show. He didn't feel anything. Is that normal? Can everyone who is soul bonded feel their bond? No, not everyone, Briam chuckled. Only a tiny minority can, and nobody is sure why. I can, though. I guess I'm lucky that way. Zorian suppressed a scowl. He had been hoping that him not being able to sense any bonds meant there was none, but apparently that was no proof. Damn. You know, Zorian tried, I've always had an academic interest in familiars and soul bonds. Thankfully, Briam didn't find Zorian's interest in any way suspicious and was happy to indulge Zorian's curiosity. What Briam told him was interesting, to say the least. According to Briam, the soul bond spell was actually a ritual of some sort, one that took at least 10 minutes to properly cast, and usually more. Not something you cast as a regular invocation. Also, even the most oblivious of participants tended to feel something after a few weeks, after the bond had properly anchored itself to the participants. There were a lot of things Zorian had experienced so far in the time loop that could qualify as signs of a developing soul bond, but it was hard to say how much of that was simply a consequence of the crazy situation he had found himself in. The effects were just too weak compared to what Briam told him should happen. His mana reserves were slightly larger than they had been at the start of the time loop, for instance, but the increase was nothing special. It could just as easily be a consequence of his regular combat magic practice instead of being caused by the soul bond trying to twist his soul to be more in line with Zack's. The spell that the lich cast on them definitely wasn't a ritual either, but then again, it was a lich. Who knew what kind of magic a creature like that had at its disposal? All in all, it would appear he was lucky. The link between him and Zack was either very weak or of a different type. Or perhaps it was only half-formed. According to Briam, the bond required physical proximity and a lot of personal interaction between participants to fully mature. It was why he carried his fire drake everywhere he went at this point in time. Considering he only interacted with Zack in one of the restarts so far, and that the boy spent virtually all of the restarts away from Cyoria, the bond may have never gotten the chance to solidify. If so, he must never allow it to fully form. He would avoid contact with the other time traveler from now on until he could figure out more about what was happening. Which, admittedly, could take a while. Hopefully his idea of avoiding Zack as much as possible would keep him from being overwhelmed by the bond in the meantime. He really ought to make a learning plan for himself. So far, he had been learning things rather haphazardly. There was no hurry, as far as he knew, and he didn't know where to begin anyway. Also, he had wanted to grow a little as a mage before breaking out of the time loop, since he would never get an opportunity like this again. That kind of disorganized approach was no longer appropriate. However, he wanted the soul bond broken as soon as possible, and that meant finding a way out of the time loop as quickly as possible. But that would have to wait for another time, because he had a meeting with Taven and her friends scheduled for the evening. Why did he agree to this again? Oh yes, Taven picked a really inconvenient moment and he had a momentary bout of insanity. He should have at least gotten some favor out of her for doing this. Oh well, live and learn. Taven had chosen an annoyingly distant meeting place, so Zorian had a long trek across in front of him. Apparently there was a meeting spot for chess players in one of Sayoria's parks, and one of Taven's friends was a regular visitor. He never actually visited that particular park, but the path towards it was somewhat familiar and he couldn't figure out why. He realized why it was familiar a few minutes later when he stumbled on a small bridge just inside the park. This was where he had met that crying little girl whose bicycle fell into the stream, back before he was aware of the time loop. Come to think of it, he never visited this place after that, did he? There just wasn't any reason to, since he knew in advance there were obstacles blocking his path if he went this way. He peered curiously at the section of the creek beneath the bridge, trying to see if the bike was still there. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't. Yesterday's heavy rain had swelled the creek into a raging torrent, and the bicycle was, no doubt, picked up by the currents and swept along. The little girl wasn't there this time, of course, but that didn't mean he was alone on the bridge. There was a smallish cat, probably a very young one, looking forlornly at the raging waters of the stream. Zorian didn't generally stress himself about the plight of animals, but when the cat turned to look at him and their eyes met, he was assaulted by an intense feeling of sadness and loss. Unnerved by the experience, he picked up his pace, hurriedly leaving the strange cat behind him. Finally, after nearly 30 minutes of wandering the park, he found the meeting place. Taven should really learn how to give proper directions one of these days. It was a rather peaceful place, though populated almost entirely by old people. As in, really old people. Taven's group of teenagers stuck out like a sore thumb, but none of the old geezers surrounding them seemed to mind, so Zorian decided not to let it bother him and cautiously approached. Taven's other friends were a pair of gruff, muscular boys that looked more at home in the boxing ring than in a mage school. One of them was currently frowning at the chessboard in front of him, contemplating his next move, while Taven and the other boy sat on each side of him. Taven was clearly impatient and bored out of her skull, at one point actually trying to snatch a figurine from the board to pass the time with, only to get foiled by the players. The other boy was more relaxed, lazily observing everything around him like a guard dog. It was this other boy who noticed him and pointed him out to the other two. Roach. Taven waved. Thank the gods, I was starting to fear you'd never show up. I wasn't late, Zorian protested. Well, you sure developed a habit of cutting it close since the last time we saw each other, she accused. But anyway. Roach, I'd like you to meet my two minions, Grunt and Mumble. Grunt, Mumble, this is my good friend Roach. Zorian rolled his eyes. At least it's not just him who gets a stupid nickname. Damn it, I told you not to introduce us like that. One of the boys protested. It was more out of force of habit than because he honestly expected Taven to change, if Zorian was reading things correctly. He sighed and turned towards Zorian. Hi, kid. I'm Yurik, and the guy playing chess is Orin. Thanks for helping us out like this. We'll make sure nothing happens to you, so don't worry about anything. The chess player grunted, possibly in agreement. That must be Grunt, then. I'm Zorian, he spoke back. The guy never told him their last names, so why should he tell them his? Right, said Taven enthusiastically. Introductions are over, so let's get going, shall we? Not until I finish this round, the chess player said flatly. Taven's shoulders slumped in defeat. I hate that game, Taven whined. Find yourself a seat, Roach. This could take a while. Zorian clacked his tongue in annoyance. For once Zorian empathized with Taven's impatience. He wasn't a big fan of chess either. Break. The dungeon was an extremely dangerous place. Also known as the underworld, the labyrinth, and a million other names, it was a staggeringly extensive network of caves and tunnels that ran beneath the surface of the world. At first glance, the place seemed like every mage's dream come true. Ambient mana levels increased the deeper one descended into the endless depths of the dungeon cave system, and the lower levels were practically swimming with useful minerals with fantastic magical properties. Unfortunately, mages were just one of the many creatures that thrived in such an environment. Monsters of all sorts lived in the tunnels, and the deeper one went the stronger and more alien they became. Even the greatest of archmages had to take care not to go too deep when exploring the dungeon, lest they come face to face with something they had no hope of defeating. Cyoria, like many other cities, took advantage of the dungeon beneath it when the city was being built. The topmost portion of the dungeon was cleared of anything aggressive or particularly dangerous and then systematically walled off from the deeper levels. These tunnels were then modified into shelters, storage spaces, flood control systems, and the city sewer system. Human settlements had used the dungeon as a sewer for so long that several species of oozes and other monsters adapted specifically to take advantage of this unique ecological niche, and humans often transplanted them from one city to the next when they built new settlements. Of course, the separation of this topmost layer from the deeper parts of the dungeon was never 100% effective, especially since many dungeon denizens were very capable diggers. Regular maintenance was required to keep the whole thing functioning properly. Cyoria's dungeon boundary was widely known to have more holes than a sponge. It was a fairly young city, and the local dungeon was particularly extensive. It grew too big, too fast, and a proper separation between layers was never finalized. That was probably why the invaders managed to smuggle an entire army of monsters into the city by having them pour straight out of the tunnels, though how exactly the invaders mapped out the deep dungeon well enough to find a route big enough for an army to pass through is anyone's guess. Just one more example of how ridiculously well prepared the enemy was, Zorian supposed. Despite the obvious danger, Zorian wasn't too worried about following Taven into the tunnels. Cyoria's underground wasn't the safest place in the world, but it was by no means a certain death sentence either. And he doubted the invaders were currently in there, since a giant army of monsters living just beneath the city was absolutely impossible to hide. Regardless of how good the invasion organizers were, they would have to navigate their route on the day of the invasion to avoid detection. He would feel better if he had a focusing item for his combat magic, of course, but that was beyond his reach at this point. Nora's tutoring aside, he still wasn't good enough with spell formulas to make one from scratch, and he couldn't buy one without a permit. Unfortunately, their employer didn't seem to share Zorian's confidence. "This is the fourth member you found," the old man demanded incredulously. "Did he even graduate yet?" Zorian looked at the scowling man waving towards him in a dismissive manner and promptly decided he could understand Taven's irritation with the guy. If the guy was so worried about their ability to deliver results, why didn't he hire an actual professional to recover his damn watch? Oh, that's right, he didn't want to pay a professional's wage. Frankly, Taven and her group were probably the best he could hope to get, considering where he looked for help. The job itself was simple enough. The old man lost a pocket watch in the tunnels while fleeing from a duo of giant spiders, and now they had to get it back. The old man tried to retrieve it, but when he came back to the spot where he had dropped it, it was no longer there. Personally, Zorian was sure it was eaten by an ooze or some other metal-eating scavenger living in the tunnels, but the old man insisted it was still intact and in the spider's possession. How he knew that was anyone's guess. What would a bunch of spiders, giant or otherwise, do with a watch? Were they like magpies, collecting shiny items just because? "Nope," Zorian said, completely unrepentant. "I'm a third year." "A third year," the man squawked. "And you think you can survive down there? Do you even know any combat magic?" "Sure do," confirmed Zorian immediately. "Magic missile, shield and flamethrower." That's all? You get what you pay for, Zorian shrugged. Look, what's your problem? Taven interrupted. It's 4 of us versus 2 largish spiders. I alone would be enough for that. Just because I only encountered 2 doesn't mean there isn't more of them, the man grunted. I don't want you to stumble on a whole hive of those things and get slaughtered. Those things are fast. And stealthy, I didn't even notice them until they were right on top of me. I'm lucky to be alive, talking to you 4. Well, there's 4 pair of eyes among us, Taven reasoned. We'll watch each other's backs, so good luck on them sneaking up on us. I don't suppose you'll finally tell us what's so important about that watch you lost? It's none of your business, the man shot back. It's not valuable or anything, I just have sentimental reasons for wanting it back. He shook his head. I suppose the kid is right. I got what I could, considering the reward I'm offering. Just, don't get careless. I don't want the lives of a bunch of children weighing on my soul when I finally die. A few minutes and a whole lot of pointless bickering later, Taven finally led them all towards the nearby dungeon entrance. There were guards stationed there, but Taven had a permit to go in and could bring people with her, so they were free to pass. That was reassuring. At least, it meant someone in the permit office considered Taven capable enough to keep relative non-combatants like himself safe down there. Apparently she hadn't been talking completely out of her ass when she had said she could protect him. The tunnels themselves were a lot less sinister than Zorian imagined, or at least this particular section was smooth stone walls and nothing more threatening than rats wandering around. The stone covering the corridors reflected light pretty well, so the 4 floating lanterns they had hovering above them, Taven insisted they all cast one and space them away from each other, so they wouldn't be immediately plunged into darkness on the off chance they encountered something that could dispel them, illuminated the tunnels quite nicely. Unfortunately, there was no sign of either the missing watch or the giant spiders. Taven seemed to think it would be easy to track down the spiders with a simple locate creature spell, and was stumped when the spell, and all other divinations she tried, for that matter, came out empty. As it turned out, Taven and her 2 friends were more than a little specialized in combat magic, and didn't have the faintest idea how to go about tracking down either the watch or the spiders once their rudimentary divination attempts failed. Eventually they settled on just wandering around, hoping they'd stumble on the spider's lair, occasionally repeating the divinations with no effect. After about 2 hours of that, Zorian was ready to call it quits. He was just about to suggest they give up and come back tomorrow, when he suddenly felt very, very sleepy. Being a mage required a great deal of mental discipline, shaping mana correctly required focus and ability to visualize the desired result with crystal clarity. As such, all mages were, to an extent, resistant to mind magic and other effects targeting the mind. It was the only reason why Zorian was still awake and desperately fighting the sleep spell, instead of collapsing on the ground in deep slumber. In front of him he saw Taven and one of her friends sway on the spot as they tried to resist the spell as well, while the other boy already laid sprawled on the floor. He struggled with the spell for a second or 2, and then the sleep effect just withdrew. Before he could do anything, he was forced on his knees by a stream of memories and images that bored themselves directly into his mind. Confusion. A memory of him staring at a particularly baffling spell formula problem, tapping his pen against the table in frustration. An image of 2 floating balls of water connected by a collection of ever-shifting streams of water flowing from one orb to another. An alien memory of a war troll tearing through delicate white walls that seemed to be made solely out of cobwebs. A question. Are you Dash? The voice boomed in his mind, before collapsing into another psychedelic collection of images and alien memories. The deluge lessened for a moment, as if waiting for a response. Then it started again. Frustration. I thought Dash, brotherhood. Webs stretching across lightless chasms, orbs of light trapped within them. Don't understand me, do you? Sadness. Pity. More frustration. Resignation. The flow of images abruptly stopped assaulting his mind. Zorian clutched his head to lessen the raging headache pulsing inside his head and looked around. Taven and her two friends were unconscious, but appeared to be unharmed. There was no trace of their attacker anywhere. He tried to wake them up, but they wouldn't budge. Deciding the best idea would be to get back to the surface before something decided to finish them off, Zorian promptly cast the floating disc spell and piled his 3 unconscious teammates on top of it before making a beeline towards the dungeon entrance. He just hoped his head would stop killing him by tomorrow. Break. Zorian woke up very confused. A part of him was wondering what he was doing in a hospital, of all things, while another part was surprised he hadn't woken up back in Siren with Kiriel wishing him a good morning, just like every time he started over. A few seconds later his mind cleared up and he remembered what had happened yesterday. He didn't start over because he hadn't died in the tunnels, he just had his mind scrambled. This was actually far more worrying than merely dying, since any damage to his mind carried over across restarts, but it would seem he didn't suffer any permanent damage. He vaguely remembered the doctor concluding the same when he was brought in yesterday, before shoving him into this room and telling him to sleep it off. Some doctor. He didn't need a hospital for that. He wondered how Taven and her two friends were faring. They had been still completely comatose when he had stumbled out of the dungeon entrance and the guards had rushed them all to the nearest hospital. Finally awake, I see, Ilse said from the doorway. Do you feel up to talking or should I come back later? Miss Salady? Zorian asked. What are you doing here? As our student, the Academy is obliged to represent you in legal matters, Ilse said, approaching his bed. This qualifies. How are you feeling? I'm fine, Zorian shrugged. He didn't even have a headache anymore. I might as well go home once you finish questioning me. Questioning you? Ilse asked. It sounds almost sinister, the way you say it. Why would I be questioning you? Well, Zorian fumbled. The police tend to be hardasses towards witnesses in my experience. Just in case they're hiding something and all that. For a moment Zorian thought she would ask him where he got that kind of experience with the police, but she instead just shook her head and chuckled. Well, I'm not the police, Ilse said. Though I did come to ask you what happened. Your friends don't remember anything substantial, having been hit with that sleep spell right at the start of the attack. Are they all right? Zorian asked. Yes, Ilse confirmed. They woke up yesterday with no ill effects. Your injuries were far more serious, medically speaking. She gave him a wry smile. I think it was their pride that was hurt the most. A third year resisted a spell they could not and saved their lives. Sayoria's dungeon boundary is infamously porous. If it weren't for you, they probably would have been dead by morning. Zorian looked away uncomfortably. Is that why Taven had never contacted him after that initial invitation to go with her at the start of each restart? He thought she was being callous. How did he resist that sleep spell, though, if Taven and her two friends didn't? And what happened afterwards? It hurt, and it was unpleasant, but he had a feeling it wasn't an attack. His attacker could have finished him off at any particular time but chose not to. The words, the images, it was as if something was trying to talk to him but didn't know how to communicate with humans properly. Considering the number of webs and the alien memories he had been bombarded with, it was probably the spiders. He never heard of any sentient spiders with access to mind magic, though. I'm not really sure what happened, Zorian finally said. After the sleep spell failed, I was immediately bombarded by a barrage of images that almost made me black out. It was very painful and disorienting. After it stopped I tried to get my bearings to respond to further attacks, but after a minute or so I realized none were coming and decided to hightail out of there. I have no idea why the attackers stopped. Ilsa hummed. There are lots of possibilities. Maybe, instead of walking into a deliberate ambush, you simply stumbled upon someone who didn't want to be seen and they moved to incapacitate you so they could slip away unnoticed. Maybe someone left a spell trap in that section of the tunnels for whatever reason and you set off the trigger. Maybe you resisting 2 spells in a row intimidated them into leaving. We may never know, I guess. Yes, all valid possibilities. It certainly wasn't giant sentient telepathic spiders, no sir. Oh, and Zorian? Ilsa continued. You're forbidden from going down in the tunnels until further notice. I get that you wanted to help a friend, but it was still a foolish thing to do. Yes, Professor, Zorian agreed. Understood. 10 minutes after Ilsa left, the nurse came to tell him he could go home. Break. This is boring. Taven complained. Zorian cracked one of his eyes open so he could glare at her. You said you wanted to make it up to me, he reminded. But I meant teaching you some kick-ass spells, not, she scowled at the bowl full of marbles in front of her. Throwing marbles over your shoulders. Shouldn't I at least aim a couple at your forehead? I bet you'd be a lot more motivated to get it right that way. If you do that, I'm going to track you down to your room and suffocate you in your sleep, Zorian threatened heatedly. The whole reason he was having her do this was so that he could practice this stupid trick without suffering through Svim's methods. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. After a few seconds he felt the mana-charged marble pass in the vicinity of his face but couldn't pinpoint over which shoulder it flew. Left, he tried. No, right, Taven. Now you're just guessing, aren't you? Just give it a rest for today, you're not going to get anywhere once you get frustrated. No, I just need a couple of minutes to calm down, Zorian sighed. Taven groaned in response and he opened both eyes so he could properly glare at her. Why are you being so difficult about this, anyway? You know I can't ask anyone else to do this for me, right? I don't know anyone else who can aim their throws precisely enough, and none of them could keep charging marbles for more than half an hour without depleting their reserves. I know, Taven sighed. And I'm glad you asked me for help. It's the least I could do after, well, you know. But you're not taking advantage of me properly. Zorian raised an eyebrow. That came out wrong, Taven chuckled nervously. What I meant was, I can do much more than this. My accurate marble throwing skills aren't my only gift. I know I must seem pretty pathetic for getting knocked out by a single spell, but come on. I never thought of you as pathetic because of that, Taven, Zorian sighed. But all right. What can the great Taven do for me? Teach you how to fight, of course, she grinned. The magical way, I hope, Zorian remarked warningly. You should never underestimate the usefulness of a fist to the face, even in a magical duel, Taven grunted. But yes, I meant the magical way. Were you telling the truth when you told the old guy who hired us you can cast magic missile, shield and flamethrower? Of course, Zorian said. Of course, Zorian said. Well, let's see them, Taven said, waving towards a duo of dummies on the other side of the room. Won't your parents mind if I wreck their training dummies? Zorian asked. She rolled her eyes. The whole reason I told you to come to my place was so we could train here. The whole room is warded, and those dummies especially. You won't even scratch them, trust me. Shrugging, Zorian quickly cast a magic missile, shaping it into a piercer and weaving a homing function into it so it would hit the head of the dummy. The bolt of force sped across the room and struck the dummy square in the forehead. The faceless wooden head of the dummy bent backwards with the force of the blow in a manner that would snap a real human's neck in several places, but then promptly snapped back to its default position as if nothing was wrong. A decent magic missile, Taven praised. I like that you can cast one without a spell focus. I thought that would be the first thing I would have to teach you. Her hands blurred in a dizzying display of skill, the chant spoken so softly he barely even heard it. A veritable swarm of magic missiles erupted from her hands, speeding towards the dummy with a lot more speed than Zorian's piercer had and impacting it with enough force to lift it off its feet and smash it into the wall behind it. Though they were simply smashers, Zorian knew they were a lot more dangerous than the piercer he had produced, even individually. She didn't appear the slightest bit strained by the effort to produce the display. So was there any purpose for doing that, other than rubbing in how far beyond me you are? Zorian inquired. Firing that many magic missiles, even sequentially, would drain my reserves dry on the spot. I don't think I'll be repeating your feat anytime soon. Really? Taven asked. I guess I kind of assumed your mana reserves are huge, like your brother's. How many magic missiles can you cast in one sitting? 11, Zorian said, pointedly ignoring her first remark. It started out as 8, but I increased it somewhat. 8. Taven gaped. But that's practically below average. Zorian knew nothing good would come out of blowing up at her. It was Taven. She didn't really think before speaking, and if you were bothered by that you had no business interacting with her. Does that mean you admit defeat and we should get back to the marbles? He asked with deceptive cheer. No, she shrieked. No, I was just surprised, that's all. I sort of wanted to teach you how to cast multiple magic missiles with one casting, but I suppose it wouldn't do you much good with such tiny mana reserves. You should make your every spell count instead of going for quantity. Show me your shield and flamethrower while I think of something. After trying to burn a dummy to a crisp and failing, Zorian cast a quick shield, thinking just its existence would be enough of a proof for Taven. Apparently not, as she immediately whipped out a spell rod out of her belt and fired a smallish purple projectile at the shield. Zorian's eyes widened at the unexpected attack, but the attack splashed harmlessly against the semi-transparent plane of force and dissipated into a puff of purple smoke that soon disappeared without a trace entirely. What the hell was that? Zorian demanded. I was just checking if the shield can hold, Taven told him. The spell is harmless, just a simple coloring bolt that carries some force to it. Zorian wanted to tell her his shield held against a hostile mage that was actually trying to kill him, but he couldn't really do that. He settled on giving her an annoyed look. Eventually, Taven admitted she couldn't think of anything at the moment and reluctantly started throwing marbles over his shoulders again. She made it clear to him, however, that she would enlist help from her parents in the coming days, and that this way of training was a one-time thing. Zorian managed to negotiate at least an hour of marble throwing each session, in addition to whatever crazy scheme she would come up with eventually. Truthfully, combat magic was only a side interest at the moment. He was starting to realize he couldn't keep blundering blindly through this. As much as he had wanted to advance his magical studies before finding the exit, he couldn't simply ignore the danger posed by the possibility of a soul bond. The longer he stayed inside, the bigger the chance of the bond activating in full force and devouring his will and personality. The mental assault he recently went through simply highlighted that the time loop had its own dangers, and that it was irresponsible to take them lightly. A rough plan was forming in his head. He needed to find out everything he could about the time loop, how it came to be, how it functioned exactly, and how he could get out of it. Also, what was the nature of his connection to Zack? And what was the deal with the invasion? It seemed too conveniently timed to be a coincidence, so what was its connection with the time loop? Finding answers to those questions would require skills in divination, information gathering, and infiltration, so that's where the bulk of his efforts should focus on. He still intended to learn other things too, of course, but these three things were a must and a priority. He would have to finish his semi-apprenticeship in the library and learn all the tricks of that trade he could within the constraints of the time loop. The Academy Library was an incredible resource to have, and he was sure he would have to use it extensively if he was to find answers to the questions that were plaguing him. So far his attempts to use it had not yielded much in the way of results, but that was probably a consequence of insufficient authorization and lack of research skill on his part than an actual void of information on the topics in question. He needed to know how to bypass the protections on the secure sections of the library, and how to search them efficiently once he got through, and Kirithishley and Ivory were his best shot in getting there. He would apply for the job in the library first thing tomorrow morning. And, though it was too late for that in this particular restart, he should impress Ilsa again and choose divination as his interest this time. If Ilsa's choice was even halfway as motivated as Nora Bull was, he would have a particularly easy avenue on learning that otherwise tricky subject. And then, as he was climbing the stairs inside his apartment building, everything went black and he woke up Valkyrie jumping on him and wishing him good morning. Apparently Zack died again. Only a few days into the restart this time, too. Hopefully Zack would get the hang of whatever he was attempting very soon, because being wrenched without warning into another restart could get old really fast. He would soon learn he should really stop tempting fate with such thoughts.